Thank you. This year, of course, marks the 50th anniversary of the convening of the Second Vatican Council. In fact, it was 50 years ago, October 11th, that the Council convened in the presence of some 2,200 bishops. In his opening allocution, Pope John XXIII reminded the bishops that history is the teacher of life. From the outset, the bishops understood that the Pope's emphasis on the lessons of history gave the Council a different agenda than the 20 previous ecumenical councils running back to Nicaea. Whereas other councils had to settle serious disputes about doctrine, questions of discipline connected to the doctrines, Pope John's council had a broader agenda. Namely, taking stock of the whole of the life of the Church in the waning decades of the 20th century. An interesting fact, the last ecumenical council that had completed all of its work was the Council of Trent, which ended in 1563. The First Vatican Council, about which I have something to say later, ended abruptly after only 8 months because of the Franco-Prussian War. So, a lot of church life and practice had accumulated over the 4 centuries since Trent. I think that's the longest gap in the history of the Church in ecumenical councils. So, we think backwards as human beings, and thus lessons of history, but we live toward the future. So when he first announced the council, Pope John said it was also necessary to discern the signs of the times. And some of you who are my age or older remember the Italian term aggiornamento, a bringing up to date or a renewal. And so both these, the lessons of history and discerning signs of the times, gave this council a pastoral rather than a doctrinal focus, proof of which was the fact that Rome even invited both Protestant and Orthodox observers. Eventually, more than 100 non-Catholic observers attended the 4 sessions of the council. Over these 4 sessions, the council produced 16 documents, and this afternoon I want to talk about one of them, perhaps the most controversial one, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. In Roman fashion, documents are titled according to the first 2 words. But before I turn to the substance of Dignitatis, I want to talk about some other interesting facts. It's the second shortest document issued by the Council, 4,600 words in Latin, about 8 single-spaced pages in our 8.5 by 11 format. But what should really arrest our attention is that it took more than 4 years to compose this little document, which is hardly the size of a student term paper. The first draft was actually composed a year before the council convened. The final draft was signed less than 24 hours before the council was adjourned. It took almost 6 years to write those 4,600 words. Why did it take so long? Well, no one was in doubt that religious liberty was an issue of the first importance. 50 years ago, this month, Pope John XXIII began working on an encyclical that would be called Pacem in Terris, which declared, and I quote, "Among man's rights is that of being able to worship God in accordance with the right dictates of his own conscience and to profess his religion both in private and in public," unquote. Before he died, in the course of the first session of the Vatican Council, the Pope himself put religious liberty in the spotlight by issuing an encyclical saying it was so. The subject had already been slated for inclusion in 3 different documents, all of which were being drafted at the same time, and the Pope's encyclical fell like a bombshell on all 3 commissions. First, religious liberty was to be discussed as a subsection of a document on the nature of the church under the title Relations Between Church and State. Second, as a subsection of a document on ecumenism, specifically under freedom of cult. And third, as a subsection of a document on the church's relations to non-Christian religions. People today still speak of the controversial nature of Dignitatis Humanae, but the most controversial thing at the time was where and in what context to discuss the subject. So-called conservatives wanted it tucked inside of a document on the church, in the mode of what used to be called ecclesiastical public law. Progressives wanted it to occupy a prominent place in ecumenism, but contrary to journalistic opinion, which so influenced the American understanding of this document, neither one of those sides prevailed. It was Pope John's own encyclical that guaranteed that the subject of religious liberty would be a freestanding document. This was in effect settled in April 1963 when that encyclical was issued, but in my research, I'm pretty sure it was settled in January 1963 because those passages in Pacem in Terris, speaking of religious liberty as a human right, were already being vetted all around Rome. Everyone knew what was coming in April. So, to spin the reel forward, in November 1964, in November 1964, the third session of the Council, after more than 400 suggestions and emendations, a draft was presented as an independent document with the title Declaration on Religious Freedom, or the right of the person in communities to freedom in matters religious, unquote. But the text had now swollen to twice its original size, and it was fraught with historical, legal, political, philosophical, theological issues. Ordinarily, a declaration would be a very short and concise document. Dignitatis Humanae was now slated to be a declaratio, which differs from a constitutio and a decretum. Constitutions and decrees have binding force upon the entire church. A declaration, on the other hand, is reserved for matters and for persons who are not under the public law of the church. Hence, the document on non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate, is also called a declaratio. They should be short. During the drafting process, some bishops wanted to make it even larger than the way it stood in November 1964. Some worried about philosophical questions that were not adequately addressed and nuanced. Some bishops worried about practical things, probably most of them in this category. For example, what would be the effect of this declaration on the Vatican's relation by concordat to different states? Others worried about ideologies, indifferentism, it doesn't matter what religion you are, or laicism, in effect, lay control of the church through the state. Still others worried about how to interrelate these canonical, international, and natural rights. On extremes were those who wished the document to clearly and decisively rehearse and to settle the broken history of church-state relations going all the way back to Constantine, perhaps. Gradually, by trial and error, the Commission and the conciliar bishops realized that the declaration could not do all of these things. It could not convey the entire complexity of the subject matter, nor could it provide a comprehensive model of religious liberty immediately applicable to all of the institutions having a stake in the question. In my view, this insight did not indicate any kind of intellectual or moral deficiency. Rather, it showed a very healthy respect for the subject matter. Don't say more than you can say well. In the final version of the Council, the text underwent 4 major revisions, incorporating more than 200 more suggestions. An initial vote yielded a large number of placet votes, and placet modum, juxta modum votes, agree with modifications. So, several hundred more corrections were introduced. By the time of the final vote in December 1965, more than 2,000 corrections had been considered. The final vote was 1997 to 224. And it was quite a feat to produce a 4,600-word document on such a disputed and complicated subject, and to garner that kind of a vote. I'd like to say 4,600 words. If you consider the American Supreme Court decision McCreary County against ACLU, 2005, on religious display issues, it consists of 25,000 words, and a reasonable person could be in doubt about both the principles and their application. So I think making a small document, very tersely written, was a good thing. And it's held up, I think, because of that. The American bishops did play a major role in moving this little document along to a final vote. At the third plenary session, Father John Courtney Murray said, "The issue of religious liberty is, as it were, the American issue at the Council." Understandably, compared to Europe and her former colonies, Americans had settled the issue constitutionally 2 centuries ago. Individuals and religious groups were at liberty in their beliefs and practices without compromise to the integrity of the political common good. While the American bishops at the Council were not as astutely trained in theology or Latin as their European colleagues, they were very shrewd about the lessons of history when it came to this issue. Cardinal Spellman, New York, Ritter, St. Louis, Cushing, Boston, O'Boyle, D.C., among others, made crucial interventions on the floor of the Council, engaged back-channel politics to ensure that Dignitatis would see the light of day. It's also significant that 3 groups of bishops who consistently voted as a bloc in support of Dignitatis Humanae were the Americans, the Africans, and the bishops behind the Iron Curtain, especially the Polish prelates, and notably the Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła. These bishops understood that one of the signal changes since the Council of Trent was the fact that the Church had more to gain from a constitutionally guaranteed religious liberty than by becoming a religion of a particular government. At the time Dignitatis was being drafted, 55 million Catholics lived behind the Iron Curtain. During the Council, the Polish ecclesiastics would meet in the apartment of Monsignor Maliński to exchange ideas about the goals of the Council. And Archbishop Wojtyła was invited to chat with his Polish friends, young and old, asked for his opinion about the document on religious liberty. He said, "It is the end of the Constantine era, which was characterized by a strict accord between altar and throne, between church and state, illustrated in its highest point by the birth of the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th century." I'm sure Wojtyła had to mention that since his father served in the army of that empire. I continue. "We face a grave problem to elaborate new forms for relations between church and state, especially the right of the church to religious liberty." I think this represented very clearly the Polish position on this, behind the Iron Curtain. As it happened, Dignitatis Humanae, although it was muscled through politically by the Americans, was written and rewritten almost entirely by Europeans, particularly Belgian, Dutch, French, and Italian. And they dominated the internal debates within the drafting commission. And I think it's quite appropriate that the Europeans dominated that discussion on the inside of the commission. For the historic problems did not come from America, they came from Europe. And it was the European prelates who had to fix them. So the document is divided into 2 parts. 2 distinct expositions of the principle of religious liberty. First, under the heading of religious liberty in general, sections 2 through 8, Dignitatis treats human dignity according to the natural law, but also human dignity as it's become, quote unquote, more fully known to human reason through centuries of experience, unquote. Second, it considers religious liberty in the light of Revelation, sections 9 to 15, where human dignity pertains specifically to the conduct of Christians as well as to the institution and doctrine of the Catholic Church. I want to begin with part 2. And I'm going to do it for a reason that probably is not obvious to people who would be reading Dignitatis today. First, there was relatively little debate over part 2, because the liberty of the Church from the state had already been solemnly settled at the First Vatican Council a century earlier. Considered from the standpoint of the evolution of church teaching, part 2 is historically antecedent to part 1. So here, I want to make reference again to Archbishop Wojtyła's remark at the council about Constantine in the East, in the Holy Roman Empire in the West. Christendom was never a unitary social, political, or juridical thing. Over 1,700 years, it took many different forms, especially among the peoples of Latin Christianity. In some places and times, the church had the upper hand. Other places and times, temporal authority or princely power predominated in relation to the church. The different forms of authority could be imperial, tribal, feudal, national. In Latin Christendom, the one thing you can always say about political Christendom, regardless of the forms of church-state union and whatever the historical climate, the relations were almost never serene, and they were usually tumultuous. Now, I'm not going to trace all the history of 1,700 years in Latin Christianity, but I want to give what I think is the central module of it that was rejected at Vatican I and is the essence of part 2 of Dignitatis Humanae. When the Christian bishops arrived at Nicaea in 325, the Emperor Constantine gave the opening allocution, dressed in white rather than purple in deference to the bishops. He referred to himself as the Episcopus Externus, the external bishop. You guys are internal bishops. I'm the external bishops. The internal bishops, according to Constantine, are consecrated to the office of performing sacraments and defining doctrine. The external bishop, however, has the ministry of superintending the temporalities of the church, the external order of things. When Constantine died and was laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, the title on his tomb read, co-equal to the apostles. This notion of the external bishop is the nerve center of the fascinating and troubled history of political Christendom. In the East, the role of the external bishop was imperial from the outset, and it followed a pretty consistent form. In the West, however, imperial authority, as we all know, collapsed rather rapidly beginning in the end of the 5th century, so the idea was established in a different way. Lay patrons, tribal chieftains, warlords, feudal lords, and then kings, 800 Charlemagne, gave lands and properties to the church, in exchange for which ecclesiastical authorities recognized what came to be known as jus patronatus, the patronal right. And as it evolves, it has 3 claims. The external bishop. Placet, it pleases, veto power over ecclesiastical acts. Exequatur, enforcement power. You make an ecclesiastical decree, King of Spain has the right to enforce it in the New World. And jus praesentandi, nomination powers of ecclesiastics. So, a baptized prince would make a benefice or an endowment for a church or a monastery. The externalities were held in fief by the appropriate ecclesiastical authority who stood to the prince as vassal to the Lord. In medieval times, the bishop or abbot would then take an oath of homage and fealty. And for his part, the prince reserved the right not only to exercise veto and enforcement powers, but also, and most importantly, to nominate the next incumbent of the ecclesiastical office. There were limits to the power. The external bishop could not consecrate a bishop, only nominate. In the 11th century, this relationship became outright warfare, and it was called the investiture controversy. Gregory VII endeavored to use papal authority to rescind these practices. And the spearhead of his assault on patronal rights was the new religious order, Cluniac monasticism, which eventually comes to include some 1,000 monasteries, all immune from the jus patronatus and under the direct jurisdiction of the Pope. While Gregory was somewhat successful in this part of the project, neither he nor his successors were able to fold the entire church into Cluniac immunities from lay control. In fact, as time went on, the system of patronal rights became more deeply entrenched. During the Reformation, the King of England and the Lutheran princes in Germany explicitly laid claim to the jus patronatus as the ground for founding their own churches. Catholic sovereigns did the same thing. In exchange for keeping their lands Catholic, Rome had to expressly recognize their patronal rights. The greatest of them all was the King of Spain, who, beginning in 1492, and over one generation, wins what was called the Patronato Universal. Wherever the flag of the King of Spain touched ground on any continent, there the King of Spain was the external bishop, so long as he kept his people Catholic. And not even the French Revolution and all of the revolutions in Europe and her former colonies removed the jus patronatus. In 1791, the new regime in France simply transferred it from the king to the nation. And thus, throughout the Spanish world even, it becomes called the Patronato Nacional. The external bishop are now states. All of this was put to an end on the part of the Church at the First Vatican Council, which is really the radical council, not Vatican II. For the first time since the Council of Nicaea, when Constantine referred to himself as external bishop, Rome declined to even send invitations to any temporal authority, including Catholics. The governments of Europe were so upset, three threatened to intervene militarily to stop this. The Pope's Secretary of State, Cardinal Antonelli, said that exclusively Catholic governments had virtually ceased to exist. In July 1870, the bishops approved the document Pastor Aeternus and recognized the Holy See's universal jurisdiction over the Catholic Church. In France, Émile Ollivier declared in the Chamber of Deputies that the Pope had, in effect, introduced the separation of church and state. And the temporal powers were infuriated, not only threatened, they never pulled it off, to militarily intervene to stop Vatican I. Austria, Holy Roman Empire, what remained of it, promptly rescinded its concordat with the Vatican. In a few years' time, Bismarck would throw half of the Catholic hierarchy in jail as payback for Vatican I. And after that, the French Third Republic would confiscate all of the church properties and close Catholic schools. But the deed was done, and it's true. It was Rome that declared officially the death of Catholic political Christendom, at least as it had been imagined and practiced for more than 1,500 years. And that's why when you go to Part 2 of Dignitatis, it simply reiterates Vatican I. The freedom of the Church is the principium fundamentale in what concerns the relations between church and governments in the civil order. Quote, the Church claims freedom as a spiritual authority established by Christ, upon rests the duty to preach the gospel to all men, etc. John Courtney Murray wrote at the time that the Declaration Dignitatis Humanae could hardly be called a milestone in human history, moral, political, or intellectual. In one sense, this is true, but probably not in the sense given to it by Murray. The milestone was, in fact, the Church's principled and solemn separation from temporal authority, and it was old news, and it was done in 1870. And I mean by separation the proposition that the Church is not in the state and that the state is not in the Church. And contrary to received opinion on this matter, it was Rome, not the secular states, who initiated it. The only two governments in all of the west of Europe who approved of this move were Belgium and Ireland. Okay. But in the decades between the late 19th century and the World War II era, it became increasingly clear, and practically urgent to follow the implications of Vatican I for religious liberty in general. I believe it's Vatican I that made the reckoning in Part 1 of Dignitatis Humanae practically unavoidable. Even so, I hold that Part 1 is the sequel, not the prequel. So, Part 1. As the demands of human dignity have become more fully known to the human reason through the centuries of experience, they claim the right of religious liberty is grounded in human dignity. The human person has the capacity and moral obligation to pursue the truth and to adhere to it when it's found. This moral obligation can be satisfied only by free intellective and volitional acts. Religious acts have the additional dimension of being ordered to God and therefore transcend the order of terrestrial and temporal affairs. Injury to religious liberty is done both to the human person and to the order established by God. The right of religious liberty includes the social nature of the human person, which covers a broad range of actions, mutual assistance of inquiry, communication, instruction, and dialogue. It especially includes the family and religious communities who rightfully enjoy their own internal solidarity and authority. Government must show favor upon and assist the exercise of religious liberty, but it would transgress its power were it to direct or take over religious acts. Now, these propositions will strike us today as being pretty familiar. I mean, post-1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights and subsequent international covenants, or even American First Amendment law as it's been understood for most of our history. But I think that Dignitatis proposes a stronger version of what we Americans mean by free exercise. For Dignitatis, the right rests not in subjective conscience, but in a duty to pursue, know, and adhere, and to communicate the truth. Protection of free worship is not enough. All of the social and institutional life of religion is included. Limits on religious liberty are not grounded in the ad hoc necessities of the state, but only as grounded in the objective moral order. I think what we call compelling state interest is not enough for Dignitatis. And because it's a fundamental right, the government should regard it proactively, showing it favor without commandeering it. And that all of this can be legally and politically accomplished without prejudice to the separate jurisdictions of religious institutions in the government. Protecting and facilitating religious liberty is not another version of establishment of religion. But let me now propose a question that Catholics ought to ask themselves, because non-Catholics surely will. Supposing that my general account is correct, the Catholic Church definitively separated itself from the superintendence of temporal powers in 1870, and a generation later, in the midst of the Cold War, affirmed religious liberty as a civil right for all. So, it seems that the Catholic Church altered its position on the basis of estimating her own advantage or disadvantage. And I think a correct answer to an honest question is an honest answer. And the answer is yes, of course. Now, I do want to note that Part 2 of Dignitatis is not just altering one's position. No essential change in the theology of the Church was done there, for it had always been held that the College of Apostles is instituted by Christ and not by Caesar. It was the temporal regimes that changed their position. They no longer became cooperators in the life of the Church, but wanted to usurp its powers and make the Church a department under the civil authority of the state. It was the sovereigns that changed their position, not the Church. But Part 1 is a different matter. And I think there are three reasons why a religion, just restricting ourselves to modern times, would support a right to religious liberty and not mere toleration in the civil sphere. The first is strictly and purely theological, or maybe philosophical. In Western Christianity, Anabaptists and Quakers clearly and resolutely insisted upon both religious liberty and separation of the garden of the church from the power of Caesar. In modern times, Catholics and Protestants, most Protestants, did not hold that position. In their bid to resolve the problem of religious wars, both Catholic and Protestant sovereigns adopted the principle cuius regio eius religio, whoever rules his religion. And this modus vivendi between sovereigns was sometimes compatible with a kind of toleration, maybe a kind of domestic modus vivendi. The Pope of Rome complained vehemently about this doctrine cuius regio eius religio, but mostly because it weakened the bond between Rome and these Catholic countries. On a fair reading of history, Anabaptists and Quakers stood almost alone in giving principled theological reasons for religious liberty in the civil sphere. Both Catholics and Protestants could agree, outside of Anabaptists, that conscience can't be directly coerced, or you can't directly coerce a profession of faith. But Anabaptists and Quakers took a deeper position on this one. Whether you like it or not, it involved their effort to separate the two tables of the Decalogue, theologically. But they were really important. Without the Anabaptists and the Quakers, we would have not had a successful outcome in the United States to this issue, at least not so early on. And I believe Anabaptists and Quakers are more important than the Enlightenment for our history on this matter of religious liberty in the civil sphere. Another position that could be kind of purely philosophical, which is more of an Enlightenment position, would be this. It's in the very nature of religious belief to consist of merely private opinions and duties. Religious beliefs, like many other kinds of private opinions and duties, are worthy of constitutional protection. Thomas Jefferson seems to have preferred this position, as did other thinkers during the Enlightenment. Those would be simple, with relatively few moving parts position in modern times for why there should be religious liberty in the civil sphere. But a second reason we could have, and religious believers could have, is entirely practical. A particular religion simply takes stock of the social and political situation and reaches the judgment that it's an illusion to think that their religion, or perhaps any other religion, can enjoy a preferred status, rights, and liberties. Usually, if you're in a minority, you have profound incentives to think this way. I always like to point to the example of Massachusetts, which kept its established church, Congregationalist church, longer than any other original state, rescinding established Congregationalism only in 1833, but chiefly because the majority of Congregationalist churches had converted to Unitarianism, and therefore tax assessments were now going to the wrong church. And the Congregationalists decided, let's call in artillery on our own position at this point, call the whole thing off. We're going to get out of the business of having preferred status or liberties with regard to religion. And by the way, I don't discount this position. I think almost all religious groups, putting Anabaptists and Quakers to one side, have to have some moment like this of soberly assessing the situation. But the third reason is what might be called, to use Cardinal Newman's terms, the coherence and vigor of a tradition. I once heard Jonathan Sacks, chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth, put the issue in this way. He was not quoting Newman. When one is at his wits in trying to assemble a piece of equipment, let's say a mail-order bookshelf from IKEA, with the parts scattered all over the floor, joints and screws all in the wrong place, there can only be one reasonable solution: read the instructions. And on Sacks's analogy, from 1870 until 1965, the Catholic bishops read the instructions. Christ himself founded the church not to be a department of the state, but to be a visible sign of a different kingdom. And these were in the original instructions. They had good reasons to extract themselves from political Christendom. both as it had been historically embodied and as it might be reasonably imagined in the present or the future, and to extract itself in order to preserve a deeper truth and coherence of a tradition that is according to the internal logic of its own communion. And that's why Part 2 of Dignitatis asserts that the principium fundamentale is the liberty of the church. But they kept on reading the instruction manual. And they see very clearly, conversion to the gospel is never to be coerced. And they understand from their own tradition as it evolves. Every sacrament presupposes the freedom of the minister and the recipient. Baptism being, infant baptism being on the borderline, but you need at least vicarious consent in that case. In other words, you can't bring someone into the sacramental order of the church by coercion. It's fundamentally contrary to both theology and the canon law of sacraments. The Christian gospel enjoins its adherents to be gentle with strangers, to love their enemies. In fact, it teaches that the foundation, as it were, its political theology is to be found in the Beatitudes, as Cardinal Newman pointed out, in the Beatitudes. And by the mid-1960s, the bishops of the Catholic Church were capable of seeing that constitutional governments post-1945 were willing and able to protect religious liberty fairly. That is, to protect religious liberty without laicism, which is religious liberty only as an excuse for the state indirectly to control the church. It seemed clear to them by then. They had good reasons in the internal logic of their own tradition to make this move. The judgment that a certain institutional pattern is dysfunctional and unworkable, and the effort to recover from the instruction manual the principles of one's own tradition is a crucial threshold that has to be moved through by religions in modern times. And I have to say, I just have in parentheses here, what do we make of Muslim peoples today, many of whom seem to have no inclination to have any one of these three reasons? That is, they neither have a fundamental theological reason, nor are they sizing things up and thinking they're going to be unsuccessful in the game of politics or demography. And when they go back and access their own tradition, it seems as though the religion's unity with the civil sphere is built in at the very beginning. I don't know. Since 1965, for the Catholic Church, the Church has fared rather well under Dignitatis Humanae. Roman Catholicism is the only pre-modern religion in the world that has no establishment in or by a state. In our lifetime, Catholic peoples overcame authoritarian regimes on the Iberian Peninsula, Latin America, Philippines, and spectacularly led a bloodless revolution in Central and Eastern Europe. Predominantly Catholic countries like Poland, Brazil, and Spain rank in the very top of the list of countries with regard to the absence of either civil or social persecution based upon religion. It's been a successful transition. Today, more often than not, and this is my final comment, the shoe is on the other foot. I say, more often than not, it's the historic democracies who are tempted to retreat from a robust protection of religious liberty, usually under the notion that a robust protection of religious liberty is only an establishment of religion in the state. So let's think of two separations. The first, the separation of church and state, properly understood, not in its 1905 French incarnation, but properly understood in the way I tried to describe it. Separation of the church from the supervision and ministry of temporal powers. No problem, it seems to me, if you access your tradition properly. And it took another generation to work all of that out for religious liberty in the civil domain. Dignitatis is the capstone of that. But it presupposed, although the church and the government are diverse jurisdictions, one is not in another, literally. The government must recognize, protect, and promote freedom of religion, not just for the individual, but for religious institutions. That's separation as it's ideally considered by the Catholic Church today. But a second separation is the separation between religion and the public square. And here, temporal power begins to run away from the theological political issue, which we thought was solved. Governments attribute to religion a point of view that's impermeable to public discourse. Even natural law arguments become unacceptable. The government, in a way, forbids itself from even knowing enough about religion to be able to enforce the rights of religion. And it's this last kind of separation that renders the state, legally and politically, incapable of affirming the right spelled out in Dignitatis Humanae, or protecting its free exercise in any meaningful way. When the state looks upon persons only as citizens and strives to form a body politic in all of its various dimensions, exclusively according to that point of view, this is a species of what Pope Paul VI and John Paul called negative confessionalism. Pope Benedict XVI suggests that it's the flip side to confessional monopoly. Although important aspects of religious liberty might remain legally intact, the state acts as though only it has a priority of access to society. And Benedict has recently remarked, it's a sophisticated form of hostility to religion, precisely because it may stop well short of legal persecution. Life is made very difficult for citizens who are religious. It's specifically the religious specification of the right of religious liberty that the state claims not to protect. It has to be reduced into private opinion and to other rubrics. I don't think that the bishops at Vatican II, in discerning the signs of the times, would have expected the historical democracies chastened by the events after 1945 would find themselves incapable of upholding Part 1 of Dignitatis Humanae. I don't think they anticipated what would happen in the very latter part of the 20th century. However, I have to tell you, I have read pretty thoroughly the internal debate of that commission that drafted Dignitatis, and of all of the objections to the document, I haven't found one that said the historic democracies are not going to uphold their part of the bargain. That's the one objection I never saw, and it's the one today that's most contested. Well, on that note, that would be another lecture. So let me close for now. Thank you.